Good evening, everybody. My name is Pete Eberle. I'm with the Colorado Renewable Energy Society, or CRES. I want to welcome you for joining us here tonight. For those of you who are new, CRES and its local chapters provide education, policy advocacy, and community engagement that accelerate Colorado towards a carbon neutral future powered by 100% renewable energy. Founded in 1996, CRES is a 501c3 nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that's sustained by our individual sustaining members, business members, as well as donations. You can sign up for our newsletter, event announcements, and social media, or become a member or a donor at cres-energy.org, CRES-energy.org. Also make sure to visit our YouTube channel where this presentation will be eventually published. We have over 260 previously recorded events and that have gained over 1.4 million views. So before we get started, a couple of quick announcements on upcoming events. Everything you'd like to know about owning an EV, that'll be on Thursday, April 17th at 6:30 p.m. That's an in-person event at the Eberle Brew House in Five Points in Denver. That's hosted by our Metro Denver chapter, NCRES, and it features Nigel Zaid, who's the founder of EV Transformation and one of the leading experts on EVs. Then at the beginning of May, we have Come Along with Fort Collins as we journey to build net zero or zero carbon new construction. That'll be on Tuesday, May the 6th. That will also be in person at Eberle Brewery in Fort Collins. And that's going to feature Brad Smith, who leads a lot of the building code initiatives for the city of Fort Collins. I also believe he sits on an advisory board for the CEO. Keith might be able to confirm that. And then we have another event. We haven't fleshed it out yet. It's going to be on agrivoltaics. I'll come up with a better title there once we get into it a little bit more. That'll be on Tuesday, May the 13th at 6:30 p.m. That'll be a webinar hosted by our Boulder chapter, BCRES. Again, you'll be able to find all of these events at cres-energy.org and go under the events tab, or if you sign up for our newsletter, we'll let you know. So without further ado, I'm gonna stop sharing here and hand it over to Keith.
Hi, Peter, and hello to everyone from CRES. Keith Hay with the Colorado Energy Office, and thank you for the opportunity to be here and to join CRES once again. Had the opportunity to speak to a number of different CRES meetings and events over the years, and always appreciate the time and the thoughtful questions. Definitely want to get to the 2040 study that we did, but I thought I would start with a little bit about my background, a little bit about the Energy Office so that folks know who I am and who we are, and then certainly jump into the study. So again, Keith Hay, I'm officially the Senior Director of Policy at the Energy Office, and I have the opportunity to serve in that role and to lead a team of about 6 or 7 folks. We represent the office before the Public Utilities Commission and the Air Quality Control Commission. I also work on our legislative efforts, the policy and the lobby front on those efforts, and have since I joined the office in 2019, so about 6 years now. I also oversee our work on regional electricity markets and transmission development in Colorado, as well as lead a team that works on studies that we have conducted over the years. And you can see on this slide the mission and the vision of the Energy Office. The policy team is one of the teams at the Energy Office that helps fulfill that mission and bring about the vision. I'm joined by colleagues in our state weatherization program, what we refer to as sci-fi, which I think might just be the coolest name in the Energy Office, but they really do building electrification, building decarbonization, and finance work, including the state's CPACE program and funding for geothermal among those. We also have a team that works on shifting transportation from fossil fuels over to low and zero emitting technologies, including vehicle electrification. And in the case of more heavy-duty vehicles, other alternatives, including hydrogen. Right now, the Energy Office has somewhere around 100 staff across those programs and others. We also have the Solar for All program and have a local government engagement program. So a lot of folks really working to drive that mission and that vision for the Energy Office. But I really came here tonight to talk with you and hopefully to engage in a dialogue around a study that we did that looked at different pathways to decarbonizing the state's electric power sector for 2040. You can see here the goal of the study, and most of the members of CRES are probably well familiar with the two greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmaps that the Polis administration has put out, as well as the state's overall economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. And so under current statute, that greenhouse gas emission target is net zero by 2050. But this study really built off of those first two roadmaps and work that we had done in the Energy Office, pushing to implement a policy that required the state's electric utilities to reach at least an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from a 2005 baseline by 2030. And so as we saw that policy be implemented, we began to see the success of that policy, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We then wanted to look forward to think about how do we continue to push for the deepest emissions reductions possible in the electric power sector as soon as we can, understanding that we want to do that in a way that maintains the reliability of the system, but also the affordability of energy in the state. And so this study was intended to help us get to those questions. And I want to do a little bit of level setting about the study before I jump into sort of where we are today and what we found in the results of the study. So first of all, like every study, this is a snapshot in time. It represents that moment when we had an opportunity to look at this. I think one of the key reasons that is important to level set on is when we went into looking at how deep we could go in terms of emissions reductions by 2040, we assumed almost a 50% growth in electric load. But that was also before we saw the emergence of AI and the emergence of data centers here in Colorado and nationally. And so while we thought that was a robust estimate of increases in electric load over that 2030 to 2040 time horizon, it certainly appears to be behind where we are today. I think the other reason that may become important is this study was really built with those technology price and cost assumptions. And at the time, we used the most up-to-date information that we had from the National Renewable Energy Lab, from our consultant Ascend Analytics that did the modeling for us behind the study. But again, we understand that the prices have changed in some cases pretty significantly from when we did this study a couple of years ago. Initially driven in part by supply chain issues, more recently driven by not just the supply chain issues, but a changing federal environment as well. The last thing I want to say about the scenario or the study, and then I'll jump back into where we are today, is that this was really a scenario analysis. And it was a scenario analysis that tried to look at this goal at the state level. And so we didn't make an effort and we're not able to model any particular utility in the state. And so while we think that the results of the study, despite everything I said, are directionally representative of where we are and where we will be able to go, I don't think that you could extrapolate from these results to what any particular utility in the state could achieve on a particular timeline. So with that as sort of background and level setting across some of the key assumptions in the study, I wanted to start with, again, where we are, because that's really where the study begins. And so this slide just represents a snapshot from 1990 to 2022 when we were doing the study that looks at the change in Colorado's energy mix. And so you can see that in the late 1990s, we really begin to ramp up gas capacity here in the state, and that was consistent with a national trajectory there. That bright purplish line that kind of floats through the middle and looks to be roughly consistent across time is Xcel Energy's Cabin Creek project, and that is stayed within a small, relatively narrow bandwidth in terms of its overall capacity in the state. And then you really begin to see, just after that 2002 timeline, the implementation of Colorado's voter-approved amendment 37, which was the first renewable energy standard in the state. And then that standard changes over time, and you can see the increase in wind and solar that begins with that, and then really is driven in large measure by the changing economics of wind and solar relative to existing coal-fired power plants. And then the last thing I would note is you begin to see that coal line tail down at the end, and that's really the beginning of Colorado's coal retirements and coal transition, first with the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act in 2010, and then a subsequent Public Utilities Commission decision retiring the Comanche or Pueblo 1 and 2 units, which the first of those shows up at the tail end of this graph. And that transition from coal to coal and gas to coal and gas and renewables is really reflected in this graph, which is the changing emissions for Colorado. And you can see that we really peaked in that 2006, 2007 timeline. And then with the increase of wind and solar supplying more of the state's electricity, as well as its capacity, you can see that decline in the overall emissions reductions through that 2002 timeline. That black bar in the middle, that 41.1 MMT, represents the baseline year against which we are calculating the emissions reduction for that 2030 80% requirement. And so the utilities, and I'll get to that in a minute, that are subject to that planning requirement and emissions reduction target really start from that black 2000 M5 baseline. And so this represents, as of probably a few weeks ago, if not a couple of months ago, our best estimate of where, well, we know where we were in 2005. I should say best estimate of where the utilities are projected to be in 2030, based on plans that have been approved either by the utility board, in the case of municipal utilities like Colorado Springs, or cooperative utilities like Holy Cross or PRPA, or in the case of Tri-State, Xcel, and Black Hills, plans that have been approved by the Public Utilities Commission. If you're like me and you're not particularly good with math that doesn't involve a spreadsheet behind it or doing math on the fly, that reduction that's represented in those two graphs is actually above the 80% requirement. And that's an 80% requirement for each of those utilities. The utilities plans range from something just above 80% to something closer to the high 90% in the case of Holy Cross. And so on average, they're getting to about an 84% emissions reduction by 2030, which is represented by that smaller stack on the right-hand side. And so again, the 2040 planning that we did took that 2030 planning that the utilities represented here had done and had approved, and we built from that to then look at that question of how deep could we go by 2040, understanding that we wanted to maintain reliability and understand the cost between where we would get in a business as usual or economic deployment scenario across all of those other scenarios that we were modeling. So again, we built into this almost a 50% increase in peak demand through 2040. You can see that that's made up of a certain amount of just base energy consumption. And you can see here the representation of building electrification, of EV load, as well as an assumption around oil and gas electrification. And all of that scales through 2040. Both the building electrification and the EV charging are consistent with the roadmap work that we've been doing. And so we assumed achievement of the state's energy policy goals. So it's not really built bottom up in that sense. We're assuming achievement of those goals and then running it out over time. Oil and gas electrification, we worked with our consultants as well as staff at the utilities and staff at the Department of Public Health and Environment to come up with a number that represented what we thought was a reasonable estimate of oil and gas electrification load. And that if I recall, and I can check the numbers later, was in the 600 megawatt range. So what did we do in the study? Well, we started with an economic deployment scenario, or what you might typically call a business as usual scenario. And so we took that assumption about the trajectory of load growth through 2040, and then built in the state's policies on transportation electrification, on building electrification, made some assumptions on potential oil and gas electrification, and then we gave the model an opportunity to essentially select the lowest cost set of resources to fill in that load. And I think what's important in that economic deployment scenario is we didn't give it an emissions target to hit. We allowed it to pick gas and just said, go pick what you need, and then we'll see where we've gotten to. All of the other scenarios that are represented in green really are what I would describe as policy-driven scenarios. And all of them assume that we will get to a zero greenhouse gas emissions reduction in 2040, and then they look at different ways of getting to that target. So we've got one that is sort of that optimized 100. Again, we gave it all of the resources except for gas in that instance. And so it could pick from wind and solar and batteries. We had both 4-hour batteries and long duration storage batteries in here. We had advanced nuclear technologies. We had combustion turbines running with hydrogen. All of that was available to the model and let it pick the least cost portfolio to get to 100%. And then in the case of the other scenarios, whether that's the wind, solar, and batteries on through the hydrogen limited scenario, we made an effort to then think through and to model what are different other pathways than just that cost optimized one, again, to see if that changed anything in terms of whether or not the system would maintain reliability, or what the relative cost would be compared to that economic deployment scenario. And so just for a moment to stop on sort of that economic deployment scenario, this is what we saw as the installed capacity for that economic deployment case, that essentially that business as usual, in the sense that we're not changing any policies or forcing the model to achieve a particular emissions reduction outcome. And so you can see, starting from the bottom, you've got wind that is growing slightly. You've got a relatively moderate growth in solar early on to a large growth in solar towards the end. Coal drops off by 2031, representing the year in which we're going to retire Comanche or Pueblo Unit 3. You can see that gray stream in the middle, which represents gas capacity in the system. So you can see that and this scenario, I should say, runs out through 2050. We ran the economic deployment through 2050 to align with the state's overall goals. So you can see that we've got gas capacity in the model through that 2050 timeframe. There's a large, I don't know whether to call it purplish or pinkish. I think it shows up on different colored monitors, but a large purple pinkish, we'll call it that, tranche that grows from very small on that left-hand side to very large on the right-hand side. And that really represents battery storage and vehicle to grid. And then you can see you've got distributed PV on the top, which again is relatively small on the left-hand side, growing to a much larger number on the right-hand side. And then finally, that last little sliver, if you can see it on your screen at the top, it may look black or gray. It's really a maroon, is distributed batteries, 2-hour lithium-ion batteries. And so you can see over time that that economic deployment scenario really relies on two significant growth in really three technologies: distributed solar, batteries of different sizes and varieties, and then utility scale solar PV. And it does retain some amount of gas, certainly through 2040, and then all the way out through 2050. And I'll talk a little bit about the implications of that and the why of that in just a minute. So this is a comparison of the installed capacity across those different scenarios. Again, that left-hand bar is that economic deployment scenario that we just looked at. That OT100 is that cost optimized scenario where the model could pick all of the technologies except gas and was constrained to meet 100% reduction in emissions by 2040 or zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2040. To the right of that, you see the hydrogen limited scenario. And the reason that we ran the hydrogen limited scenarios, if you look at the optimized 100 scenario, above the green bar, which is wind, and then the yellow bar, which is solar, you start to see a larger, darker blue bar. And that represents the model selecting green hydrogen as a resource. And the model selected several thousand megawatts of green hydrogen through 2040. And so when we were modeling this, some of the feedback that we got from different stakeholders, utilities, conservation advocacy groups, local governments, was a sort of question: what happens if that green hydrogen for some reason is not available, either from a policy basis or a cost basis? It's just not there. So we went back to the modeling team at Ascend and we asked them that question. We developed a constraint then in the model that allowed it to pick roughly 2,000 megawatts of green hydrogen and allowed it then to pick other resources that it would fill in around that hydrogen need. You can see that the model really picks up a significant amount of battery storage, including that 100-hour iron air battery that didn't show up in the cost optimized 100. That then becomes a resource that the model selects when the hydrogen is suddenly not available. The red bar across all of those stacks from the optimized 100 to the WSB or wind solar battery represents geothermal capacity in the model. So as you move from the hydrogen limited scenario to the geo or geothermal scenario, again, that model scenario is constrained to meet that zero emissions by 2040. And then we told the model to pick more geothermal. In the case of the optimized 100, it was a couple hundred megawatts. We upped that to about 600 megawatts, scaled over time from the early 2030s out to 2040. Again, to see what that would do in terms of the supply stack, reliability, and cost, and we'll get to the cost piece. The DSF is really a distribution system focused scenario. So there we were trying to get at the question of what happens if you build from the customer site out. So residential, commercial, industrial customers, where we're going to be doing more work behind the meter, whether that's in garages or basements. And then what does the model pick to fill in around that? And what does that look like from a reliability and a cost perspective. And again, you can see that represented by a much larger amount of both the yellow on the very top, which is that distributed solar, as well as those 2-hour batteries showing up as a thicker maroon bar on the top of that. The next is SMR. That's an advanced energy technology, that small modular reactor component. I think it's worth stopping here for a moment and noting that the small modular reactors did not show up in the economic deployment scenario. It did not show up in the cost optimized scenario that achieved 100% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And so in order to understand the cost and reliability implications of the nuclear, we asked the consultants to actually model a scenario in which you specifically told it, that told the model that it had to adopt a certain amount of nuclear, and then see what that did to the rest of the resources that the modeling picks. And you can see that really what ends up happening is you've got a significantly smaller chunk of batteries, distributed solar and distributed batteries. And then that far right stack that is really large, that gets to a almost 70 gigawatt build out. So almost 40% larger than the actual load that we need, represents getting to 100% greenhouse gas emission reduction using just wind, solar, and battery technologies. That is the only scenario that in the end didn't actually pass the reliability check in the way that we wanted it to run, but we included it in any case so that we could share with folks that we did that modeling, we understand the cost of it, but to also engage in that conversation that it didn't quite achieve that reliability check. And part of what we had to do to get as close as we could to doing that was to just keep stacking more batteries into that, including a lot of 100-hour iron air batteries. And so that left us wondering, is the technology really here to do that in the time that we have? So that's the installed capacity. I won't spend as long on this, but this represents the energy output from the different resources in each of those scenarios. And I think the most important takeaway here is the size of those green boxes on the bottom and the yellow or darker yellow right above those, which represent wind and solar. Across the scenarios, wind is supplying everything between about 70% and about 95% of the electricity in Colorado, regardless of scenario. And so what that told us is that by and large, the other scenarios are really picking capacity resources to replace that gas unit or that set of gas units. So again, if I go back here for a moment, you can see that large gray box, which represents that over 6,000 megawatts of gas that the model picks in that economic deployment scenario. Once we no longer allow the model to have that in order to achieve 100% emissions reduction, it's really picking other capacity resources, whether that is hydrogen thermal turbines, batteries of different varieties, geothermal in the geothermal policy-driven scenario, or nuclear in the nuclear-driven scenario. But again, you can see that outside of across all the scenarios, it's really wind and solar that is supplying the large amount of energy in Colorado across the modeling. So what happens with emissions? Because again, we wanted to see, not just do they all achieve emissions by 2040, but what is the trajectory of the emissions from 2030 through 2040? And so if you look at that graph in the upper left-hand side, that's sort of the slope of all of the different scenarios. And I will admit to you, it's really hard to see and disaggregate because really there's not a significant gap across the different modeling. You can see that the economic deployment becomes very close by 2040 to all of the other scenarios. And what we found was that while all the scenarios from the optimized 100 through the wind, solar, and battery get to 100 because they have to get to 100, the economic deployment scenario, which didn't have an emissions reduction constraint, actually achieved somewhere in the mid 90% in-state greenhouse gas emissions reduction, or overall emissions reductions, and slightly above that in-state greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I say it that way because the model actually assumed a certain level of import energy into the state, and that import energy came with an assumption around the amount of emissions that would be tied to that import energy. But the important takeaway is really this: the economic deployment scenario under the modeling we did got to a high 90% emissions reduction. And again, it wasn't constrained to meet that target, and it really was optimized on a cost basis to meet energy demand through 2040. And then the lower right-hand graph really just is intended to show what is the 95% emissions reduction bar, and where do we get relative to that emissions reduction bar. And you can see that the business as usual, which is that economic deployment scenario, has somewhere between 0.5 and 1 million metric tons of emissions from the gas units that remain on the system, and that the majority of the emissions really are energy imports and the emissions associated with those energy imports. So two takeaways there for me. One is that if we are able to get lower emissions energy imports, and of course that comes down to how the greenhouse gas accounting is done and the ability to tie that energy to a generator, we could actually, under that cost optimized economic deployment scenario, get below that 95% emissions reduction line. And then on the gas piece, the modeling that we did in that economic deployment or business as usual case, those gas units were operating by the mid 2030s on a 2 to 5% range, dropping off to the lower end of that by the time that we get to 2040. And that wasn't a result of policy. That was a result of the economics in the dispatch. The wind and solar were just that much less expensive. The batteries were that much less expensive to dispatch, and gas was really there as a capacity asset, and then used again somewhere in that 2 to 3% time by the end of the 2030s, moving into 2040. So how did the costs compare across the scenario? Again, that's something that we really wanted to look at. So this is all represented in billions of dollars on a net present value basis. And so this doesn't represent a potential change in customers' bills or potential change in customers' rates. It really was an effort to look at the capital costs, the operating costs, and operating maintenance costs, and then a cost reflective of the imports. So you can see that economic deployment scenario is just north of $40 billion and is the least expensive pathway going forward. The most expensive pathway turns out to be wind, solar, and batteries, but it's really close between that and the nuclear pathway. And each of those are about 40% more expensive than that economic deployment, with all of the other scenarios that we looked at being somewhere between that economic deployment scenario and those high-end wind, solar, and battery or nuclear scenarios, again, on a net present value basis. So key takeaway here for us in the Energy Office is really that top line, that there are a lot of different pathways to deep emissions reductions. And that economic deployment scenario, which is our least cost pathway, really represents an opportunity to meet emissions reduction, to achieve deep emissions reductions, ensure reliability, and to do it in a way that represents the least cost to customers. You can see here some of the numbers in terms of the amount of solar and wind that we would need to add in a couple of those different scenarios, but you can think of it roughly as adding anywhere between 3 and 5 times the amount of wind that we have today, and between 8 and 11 times the amount of solar that we have today. So a couple of things as we think about the amount of new resources, in particular new wind and new solar, that we are going to have to add under any of these scenarios. We modeled the state from a transmission perspective as roughly 3 different regions, trying to reflect some of the known and existing transmission constraints that we have here in Colorado. And while we modeled a small amount of imports to Colorado in order to pick up the energy needs of the model, we did not make any assumption that the state as a whole or some portion of the state would be in an organized wholesale market post 2030. Many of you probably know that there is a current statutory requirement for all of the state's transmission operators and utilities to move it, that are transmission operators to move into an organized wholesale market by 2030, absent to showing that that is not in the public interest. Some utilities have announced that they are intending to do that. Others have not. But for us, as we contemplated whether or not we would be able to do that kind of modeling and to answer those kinds of questions, it really wasn't something within the time and the budget that we had that we would be able both to model the state as a whole from sort of a resource planning perspective and then model an RTO. And so, or utilities participating in an RTO. And given that all of our utilities currently are doing resource planning at the utility level here in the state, and we expect that certainly for the 3 utilities that do it before the PUC, that they would continue to do that. We opted to model state level resource planning, recognizing that some of these questions may look very different if and when utilities were to enter some form of organized wholesale market, which is the Colorado statutory definition, or more commonly something like an RTO or ISO. I have some detail slides, but Peter, here's what I would suggest. Let's stop here. Let's start to engage in questions. And if we need to go to those detailed slides on the scenarios, we can do that. I've also got some appendix slides that have a little more information based on some of the questions. I did try to anticipate them. So I'll stop sharing for the moment and happy to dialogue with you and the members of CRES. And again, really just want to appreciate the time and the opportunity to talk with you all about this work.
Great. Well, thanks, Keith. So the first question, which I accidentally erased because I thought I answered it, but what year when was were the assumptions in the study created? Was that 2022-ish or 2023?
Yeah, I would say it's spread across 22 and 23.
Okay.
And so, in particular, some of the cost modeling assumptions come from that 2022 timeframe because there's always a little bit of a lag.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, first question here. Does Colorado have rooftop community solar, which of course is a transition from standard rooftop, usually remunerated with net energy metering, to a hybrid where excess production above consumption is sold to any community solar subscriber at rates much lower than standard retail because they cost the price of megawatts? The rooftop community solar owner, RCSO, is paid by standard community solar credits as bill credits to the CSS, i.e. this is three pairs of payers. Utility pays CSS with bill credits. CSS pays the RCSO according to production at around half the fixed retail price per kilowatt hour. RCSO provides net kilowatt hour to the utility.
So trying to read into the question just for a moment so that I understand it, it's positing that there's something in Colorado that is neither rooftop behind the meter solar or a community solar garden. It's a new thing. I am not aware of any policy in the regulated utility space that captures something like that. I'm also not aware of that in the muni or co-op space. That there is a designated rooftop community solar garden. Certainly, we have a community solar garden statute here in Colorado. It's been amended a couple of times. Happy to go into the details if there are questions around community solar gardens. But I'm not aware of a rooftop community solar statute or any type of program with the utilities that I work with regularly.
Okay. Yeah, that almost reminds me a little bit, I think it's community choice aggregation or something like that. I believe they might do that in California. Follow or a different question here. This is kind of a broader one, not sure. Why aren't feed-in tariffs used in the US as they were so successfully in Germany? Given that 2/3 of the cost of electricity is for transmission and distribution, per Excel testimony to Boulder City Council, doesn't minimizing that cost with home solar eliminate the huge embodied energy in transmission lines, transformers, etc., as well as minimizing power line fires?
I don't know that I can or want to sort of speak to the power line fire question. With respect to feed-in tariffs, I started doing this work in Colorado about the time, a little after the adoption of Amendment 37. And, in the Amendment 37 text, it contemplates net energy metering as the policy to compensate solar customers for the adoption of solar. I wasn't here when that choice was made, or was not engaged in the conversations around why the drafters chose net energy metering as opposed to a feed-in tariff. Um, my sense is that they probably thought both that it would be easier to implement and more politically viable. And once that choice was made, I think we have just carried forward with net energy metering here in the state over time.
Um, Question about the role of hydrogen in the study, because dirty hydrogen offers zero climate benefits and green hydrogen is at least currently prohibitively expensive and really kind of, you could argue, doesn't really exist quite yet on any scale. Um, Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I don't know that I would make a distinction between green hydrogen and everything else. I mean, hydrogen comes in a rainbow of colors, and based on the different technologies that produce it, you have pink hydrogen that is generated off of nuclear. You have blue hydrogen that is generated off of gas. I think that either of those would result in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared to coal. But we chose in our modeling to focus on green hydrogen because that was consistent with the conversations that we were having at the time as we were thinking about what you might call advanced energy technologies or clean, firm resources, and the state's overall commitment to getting to, the governor's 2018 commitment, sorry, of getting to, 100% clean energy by 2040. And so we chose green hydrogen. Um, Recognize that was not then nor is not now, a widely available technology or technology that we could implement. But again, we came into this wanting to uh, test that question of could we get to 100% greenhouse gas emissions reduction by 2040? Maintaining reliability, and then understanding the cost. And so we wanted to understand what hydrogen would look like. Again, we tested, it showed up a lot in the model. We had 6,000 megawatts of hydrogen CTs, and I can share my screen again for a moment. And if I do it incorrectly, we're going to get a recursive you and me, Peter. So hopefully I've done this correctly. But this shows the installed capacity of the optimized 100 scenario. And you can see that it's got the hydrogen thermal CTs. On my screen, it shows up as a greenish uh, box. It starts appearing in the really early 2030s. It's right above that red line, if you can see that bright red line in the middle, which is the geothermal. So you can see that gray line on the left, which represents gas, over time becomes much, much smaller. And as we get into the mid 2030s out to 2040, we pick up that hydrogen thermal asset. And so that was one of the things that we did is, we assumed there'd be a very small amount of that in the early 2030s and allowed the model to scale that over time. And that scales in two ways. One is new hydrogen thermal CTs coming online. The other is the transition of some of the existing gas assets into hydrogen units over time. Again, that represented our understanding of an available technology then and an available technology today. But if you think that hydrogen isn't going to show up, we still have the other modeling runs that we looked at, whether that was the wind, solar, and battery, the SMR, as well as that geothermal technology. So this certainly is that optimized 100. It is right that there was a lot of hydrogen in there, but we did test again what would happen if it wasn't available or wasn't available at that level.
Okay, great. Now, when it comes to the geothermal, are you referring to EGS, to basically electricity generation? There's no ground coupled heating and cooling per se.
No, great question. This model was all about electricity generation.
Okay.
And so that's really what we were looking at here.
Okay, perfect. Do you really think that utility aggregated VPP, i.e. demand response, will be able to outcompete bidirectional rates as like found in Fort Collins?
I don't know that I'm familiar, enough with the Fort Collins VPP implementation. I think that is something that the Public Utilities Commission is looking at right now, in a proceeding where Xcel filed its distribution system plan. The commission added to that a filing around virtual power plants. I think that we are looking forward to seeing sort of what the results of the modeling in that looks like from both a cost and reliability perspective. So that's, happy to go deeper into that if there are sort of follow-up questions on that, but I don't know the Fort Collins implementation well enough to comment.
Okay. Regarding nuclear, the CRES Policy Committee member, Chuck Kutcher, just presented on that topic a few weeks ago and concluded that nuclear just wasn't a terribly good fit for the Colorado grid and really sort of the dynamics that'll be happening down the road. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we came into this wanting to look at different scenarios, different technologies, different approaches. And what we found was the model wasn't picking up nuclear in the cost optimized cases. So in order to understand what the costs might be and the implications for the system as a whole, we had to build a scenario around the nuclear asset and then see what else filled in. I think that's part one of an answer. The other is we're moving now into a new study that was legislatively directed set 2 sessions ago, where we're going to be looking at different energy technologies in the Northwest, so that Craig Hayden area, in the west end of Montrose County, that old NUCLA area, and then in the Southeast. And as part of that, we're going to revisit this question of advanced energy technologies with updated pricing assumptions around different technologies and continue to look at that question of, is it a cost-effective resource for Colorado? We don't know. We're literally beginning that modeling in the next couple of months, and we'll be doing stakeholding up in the Northwest and potentially out in the nuclear area as well. So look forward to sharing those results with you when we have them.
Great. This study looks like it only focused on greening the electricity grid, but it doesn't seem to green the whole economy because of the deep natural gas dependence for heating. That is, to get to net zero and CO, you must be greatly pushing heat pumps that can run in the winter.
That is absolutely right. This really was answering that electricity sector question. We have a separate study that is running now that is looking at a range of scenarios to do deep decarbonization, in particular in the residential sector, trying to get at some of the same types of questions. Can we do it reliably and at what cost? We're hoping to have the results of that available over the summer, so that we can see what it looks like from the building perspective. So no, as a state, we've taken the approach of we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a sector by sector basis. And so this looks at where we are in the electric sector and where we can get to. We're doing that separately for buildings, and really a big part of that is going to be looking at different heat pump implementation curves, as well as one of the alternative scenarios we're going to look at is actually pushing more into ground source heat pumps and thermal energy networks. I don't know if you all heard, but recently Dandelion Energy, a geothermal developer based in the Northeast, partnered with Lennar and a couple of our utilities on eventually they'll build out 1,500 uh, homes that will have ground source heat pumps. And one of the things that we have looked at there, based on some work that the federal government has done, is that we can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of the building without adding to the load and the investment level on the electric grid by switching to ground source heat pumps. So one of the technologies that we want to look at in that model.
Great. And I'm actually trying to get some folks from heat.org to present on that. And I'll probably be reaching out to on the Lennar project as well. It's a follow-up to Bryce Carter's geothermal presentation last December. So everyone stay tuned. Next question. Can you talk to the study's cost assumptions for batteries, SMRs, geothermal, and hydrogen? SMR's claims for low cost power are vastly over optimistic. Geothermal remains expensive. Green hydrogen is only existing with lots of heavy subsidies. And on the other hand, battery tech seems to be surging ahead. We can realistically expect much cheaper storage costs. So what was the inputs on that front?
And I was trying to see if I had a slide on that. I know that we at one point had created slide on the cost assumptions. I would need to go back and pull the data from the workbook. But the workbook is available on the Energy Office website. So anybody who really wants to dig into that level, reach out to me or grab the workbook. I'm happy to answer those questions. Those modeling assumptions were generally built around the NREL ATB. I think the exception to that on the battery side was our consultant worked with some of their industry partners. Ascend Analytics out of Boulder was the consultant. They worked with Excel and other utilities to try and get a cost estimate on the iron air batteries that was based on some of what they were seeing in the marketplace. But again, we had sort of 4-hour batteries, 10-hour batteries, and that 100-hour iron air. And apologies, as we're talking, I can try and grab that workbook as well. But that's a data point a little deeper than I had right to hand tonight.
Well, the NREL data is public, and of course I kind of love Lazard LCOE stuff. So, and they have LCOS as well. Um, Next question. How is the cost of fuel factored in?
Yeah, so again, I will try and do this appropriately. Um, so if I've done it correctly, you will see the different costs here as a net import cost, a capital cost, and the O&M cost. And the O&M cost, the fuel is there in that O&M cost. So for the economic deployment, where we have gas, we'll have that gas commodity cost. And of course, we'll have coal costs flowing through 2030. And then for all of the other technology scenarios where we have different technologies that would have a fuel cost input, it would show up in that O&M cost line. And again, if you dig into the workbook, there is a separate line item that represents that fuel cost. So this is a higher level than what's available in the workbook. The workbook actually builds up the O&M cost assumptions.
Okay. Given the limited installed SMRs, how are the capital costs for those determined? Or is that something that's also buried in the workbook?
And so the capital cost for that is just the cost of construction, your typical sort of capital cost. I'm looking for, I had a slide on that. It's not in this particular deck. but I'm happy to try and dig that up while we're talking, or certainly can get that and share it with you and the CRES members. All of that information is available in the workbook.
Okay, great. Okay, here's the next comment. Sorry. I think the model greatly overestimates the cost of economic development. Paraphrase, as Amy Lovins pointed out in 1998, the climate problem will not be solved at a cost, but at a profit. And again, a comment that Fort Collins is starting to show that this is happening.
I'm not sure that I hear a question there. If somebody wants to
Yeah.
come back with sort of a question there, I'm happy to take the comment.
Yeah, we can go on to the next here from Alan Best. Thank you for your presentation. Since last October, I've been wondering about the load growth resulting from data centers. If the load growth will be as great as Xcel Energy forecasts and it's just transition ERP, why was there so little appreciation of this coming growth in demand in this study or elsewhere? Any ideas about why this is such a sleeper?
Yeah, Alan, I'm going to construe that as a media request, in which case I would ask you to send it to Ari, and we're happy to get you an answer on that. But at a high level, I will offer you this one thought. I am not aware of anybody 3 years ago that saw anything like this data center load emerging as quickly as it has. But we're happy to get you a better answer if that was in fact a media request, Alan. Always happy to talk with you, my friend.
Sorry, Alan, I didn't mean to out you on that one.
No, that's okay. That's okay.
Um, and there's also on that topic, every day you see a new article proclaiming it's not going to be as big, it's overestimated, it's underestimated. It's going to be a weird ride, that's for sure. Here's a question. What thoughts do you and the CEO have about the future projected demand? That's kind of the same.
On the demand on data centers or
Yeah.
large loads. Yeah. I mean, we're certainly looking at it. We're looking at it here in the state. We are evaluating what Xcel has presented in its ERP. We're talking with colleagues across the country on what they are seeing. I think that what we are hearing as we have those conversations is that there are data center developers who are clearly in the game and looking to develop and ready to go, and there are folks who are maybe what you would call land speculating. They're sort of looking to preserve space. I think the challenge for us and for other states is to figure out who's more serious and who's not, and then to come up with a set of policies to make sure that we are getting that level of investment with those serious opportunities, and working with our utilities to make sure that we are able to bring those opportunities online in a timeline that works for the developers and that is consistent with our state policy goals.
So kind of follow on to that question. Any thoughts that you can input on the data center bill SB 25-280?
We're looking at it. I believe it's up in committee on Monday. So
Okay. Did I understand you correctly that your modeling small modular nuclear showed would cost about the same as wind solar batteries? That is surprising. Did your modeling include ensuring SMD, which I understood, at least for larger nuclear, to be A, difficult to get, and B, prohibitively expensive? Any comments? And I'm not sure what SMD is, unless that's the fuel.
I'm not sure what SMB refers to, but
SMD.
if you want to reach out to whoever asked that question, so I can now, in the course of our conversation, I was able to find the slide I was looking for. So that is a representation of the capital cost for the SMR scenario by technology type. And so the important takeaway is that big purple box from 2034 to 40 represents that $35 billion CapEx investment. Again, that doesn't include the O&M. It doesn't include any imports that would be related to this scenario. That's just the CapEx investment over that 6-year period. Of course, the rest of the colors represent the other technologies that are there as well. So I think that hopefully gets to some of the question that we had around sort of the nuclear CapEx and where it shows up and how it shows up in the model.
Yeah, and I think that got it was just SMR. So yeah, you address very large CapEx and always bigger than advertised, unfortunately, with the track record of nuclear as of late. Next
And I
question.
should say, sorry, Peter, that represents about 3,800 megawatts of SMR capacity.
Okay.
CapEx. So
are there plans to maintain this model and update the report? That is to just update your assumptions going in, and as things become more, you'll have more firm outlooks as we get closer or further along, especially with the newer technologies.
yeah. Right now, the answer to that is no. It's built on a proprietary modeling platform, and we don't have regular budget to do this. So right now, no, we're not planning to do a regular update to this, but it's certainly something that the team and I have talked about internally and are trying to get an understanding of what it would cost to be able not to do this every year, but to at least take another look at it from time to time.
Okay. Could you please discuss the distribution system focused model, please? I am right that this study relied on the utility source models for this, and that the model and its assumptions remains essentially unchanged from now until 2040? That's a question. Also, did this include the study information from Brattle Group's study of demand response improvements presented to Excel and the PUC in 2022? Foss's VPP look in 2023, and the DOE VPP liftoff 2024.
So I'm trying to look at the workbook for the wind, solar, and battery now to try and help answer some of those questions. Certainly the latter two, I'm not sure exactly what is being asked there. I think the question is, did we alter the cost assumptions as we saw different reports come out? The answer to that is no. I mean, that was one of the things. Again, this is a snapshot in time. We made some modeling assumptions and then, carried those forward, right? One thing I can tell you with extreme confidence is we're wrong about the cost of all of this based on where things sit today. And so we just didn't have the ability to continually update the modeling assumptions as new papers emerge during the course of this. But again, those cost assumptions are all available, and I'm trying to grab those for you right now.
Okay. Quick follow-up question, if you're ready.
Yep.
The O&M costs for wind, solar, battery was more than the fuel costs for the other scenarios, for I'm assuming the economic scenario.
All right, so in the wind, solar, and battery scenario, we had a capital cost of 42.4 billion, and the question was the comparison of that capital cost to the O&M cost in the economic deployment or the optimized.
Well, the O&M costs for wind, solar, battery, if the fuel cost is included in the O&M costs for economic deployment,
yeah.
They're kind of like that doesn't, you'd think there'd be more fuel costs when you're actually using burning fuel, I guess is the.
Yeah, and the lower fuel cost there really is the fact that the gas units don't run much of the time in that because of the cost of the fuel. Post about 2032, they're operating again somewhere between 3% and 5% over the course of that roughly 7-year period, getting down to the 1 to 2 to 3% range by the end of that decade. And so there isn't the kind of fuel cost in that post 2030 period that we've seen to date.
Okay. So it's really a matter of you're just not using it much.
We're just not using it much. It's really a capacity asset. And that's, what you find is when you swap that, what the modeling found, I should say, was, sorry, Peter, that when you swap that gas asset for some other firm capacity resource, you get similar kinds of capacity factors, with the exception of the nuclear, which really does run a lot more often. And that's, because of the nature of the unit, which is probably something Chuck talked about last week. It's a lot less flexible, and what you see is that it's got a relatively high, it's got a somewhat higher curtailment
Yeah.
than optimized 100. I will say the
Okay.
wind, solar, and battery by far has the highest level of curtailment of any, because you've just got so many resources on the system. But
Yeah. Were your consultants able to determine what efficiency level PV would have to be to achieve the reliability goals? It seems like this could also be analyzed with respect to battery capacity, what battery capacity technology would be needed to achieve, again, the reliability targets.
I would probably have to go back and look at the workbook for that.
Okay. Let's see here. Can you provide more background on the bill that we think is coming on clean energy planning for 2040 with the 100% by 2040 and the relative cost based on the increased cost for the 100% RE shown in the Ascend study?
Yeah. So appreciate the question. I might characterize what is in that bill a little bit differently in this way. I think that based on the modeling that we did here, and in particular the modeling in the economic deployment scenario, the way that the current draft, and again, it's not a bill, it hasn't been introduced, it's not on bill paper, but the concept that is out there would drive utilities to achieve the deepest emissions reductions possible by 2040, consistent with maintaining system reliability. And then in the draft that is out there, contemplates a 1.5% cost cap. And so that lines up really along the lines of the work that the results that we were seeing in that economic deployment scenario, which is driving at those deepest emissions reductions possible by 2040 under that cost cap and while maintaining reliability. And the way we understand and read the draft that is out there, if a utility can't get to 100% by 2040 within that cost cap and maintaining reliability, it would be allowed to bring forward a plan that demonstrated the year in which they would be able to achieve that 100% reduction while maintaining reliability and under that 1.5%. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Going back to, there was a clarification. I guess just sort of elaborate on the distribution system focused model. And that's the one that included, obviously, a lot of the VPP stuff came after basically your study had been mostly made. So I'm guess actually, Jim, is there a specific item that you want clarified there when it comes to, here we go. Yeah. Specifically, the DSF model, who is actually the source of the investment cost? The study states that is not ratepayers, but please confirm that. Secondly, the model departs on the utility models that did not include VPP or better demand response improvements that others have shown to the PUC and to the state.
So if I understand correctly, the question on the CapEx cost for the distributed resources, in particular in the distribution system focused model, what's the source of the CapEx for that? So the answer to that question is that represents only the utility cost. That does not represent consumer costs at all. That modeling scenario would be significant. Again, this was intended to be on a net present value basis, comparing, basically how we would do it at the commission if we were to go there, looking at sort of the utility costs. So there's a significant cost that's not included in that wind, solar, and battery in particular, and that's the cost of that distributed solar and that distributed battery line. Now, again, that occurs in all of the modeling runs. It's just much bigger in that wind, solar, and battery piece. So that's not included here.
Okay. Great. I think that's the, oh, okay, one more question. Actually, there's two. What do you think about the future reliability of the transmission system in the face of increasingly extreme weather? And how does the CEO think we should account for the cost of outages when the transmission system goes down?
Yeah. So I don't know that I'm prepared tonight to offer an opinion on that last question in terms of how we should account for that. Um, I think one way to think about that is it probably looks different depending on what utility we're talking about and whether or not utilities are in an organized market or not. So um, that cost allocation question is a really interesting and challenging one, but it's certainly one that as we see it come forward, we will look at and evaluate. Um, and sorry, I missed the first part of that, or I forgot the first part of that question.
Oh, really, it's just, about the future reliability of the
Oh, future
transmission.
reliability of the grid. Thank you. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, you know, also a really good question. And I think I certainly, am optimistic that we will continue to maintain and operate a reliable electric grid here in the state. Um, as I think about it, one of the big challenges is going to be, are we actually able to build the grid quickly enough to match the kinds of investment we are going to see in renewable energy resources and clean energy technologies over the coming decade? We started into that conversation last year with Senate Bill 212. We ended up, in a place where we were directed to go back and to do some more studying and thinking about siting and permitting reform in the state, and we're in the midst of that process now. And so as we begin to see the results of that initial outreach, we'll continue to think through that question of how do we align transmission and generation build out in a way that matches the kinds of pace and scale that we need to meet the clean energy goals.
Okay. Can you explain why the wind solar battery model is the highest? We're always told that wind and solar batteries are getting very, very cheap. And is
Yeah.
it
So
mainly because of just the overcapacity building?
yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, if you look at this slide for a moment, and hopefully you're seeing the capacity build out, you can see that the economic deployment rests under 50 gigawatts. You've got on the other side, you've got the wind, solar, and battery that is approaching almost 70 gigawatts. The distribution system comes in at 60. And so what you find, or what the modeling results found, is the more you move from the bulk power system to the distributed system, and the more you push the firm assets, whether that's gas or hydrogen CTs off, the more you're having to add resources, whether that's batteries or distributed solar or distributed batteries. And that's really driving up that cost. And as you sort of, in your words, Peter, overbuild that system in order to meet that. Um,
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, it roughly kind of follows a little bit of the Mark Jacobson approach. Um, okay, I'm sorry, this jumped around. Oh, all right. I know it's still fresh, so perhaps it's unfair to ask this now, but do you have any initial thoughts to share about the executive order signed Tuesday, protecting American energy from state overreach and its potential impact on meeting Colorado's decarbonization goals?
yeah, we are certainly looking at and evaluating the language of that executive order and several others, and are talking to our colleagues across the country thinking about what the implications are, but it's way too early and to sort of give a firm opinion on that.
Yep. Okay. Regarding transmission, I just attended the talk by Mike Nelson, who's a proponent of a HDVC transmission the American supergrid. Should a national project like this take off, would it disrupt regional energy planning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And the answer is I don't know. We would have to see what that looks like. Again, the modeling that we didn't even model, the state moving into an organized wholesale market or an RTO. We really wanted to capture, again, that snapshot in time piece. We do all of our energy planning here in Colorado. So as we think about that and we do that, can we get to 100% emissions reduction, or how deep can we go, at that reasonable cost question? And so that's what we did. If we see an HVDC, sorry, that's hard for me to say apparently, grid emerge, I think that it will be interesting to see if and how that changes resource planning and resource adequacy questions.
Well, in theory, all the larger modeling says it's a good thing. Should make things easier. And then there's just a similar question is, how important is building more transmission lines and improving the interconnection process for helping more large-scale solar projects connect to the grid and support Colorado's clean energy goals by 2040?
Yeah, and both are hugely important. I mean, that's no surprise to the members of CRES, right? And we're going to need to build a lot more transmission. We're going to probably need to build transmission into places we don't currently have it. And that interconnection queue problem is maybe a little less serious here in Colorado in some ways because we are not in an organized wholesale market, and we have a good resource planning process that helps manage some of that. But it's certainly still an issue, that interconnection piece.
Okay, another question on, helping you redo the study with updated input. Could legislation help? And I would assume the answer is yes, if funding's attached.
I would say the second piece is probably more relevant than the first piece. It's really, do we have the dollars available to do it?
Yeah, okay. Okay, and we're getting here close to the end, so I'm going to answer hopefully these last two questions. And we'll just kind of stay on the transmission track here. One question is, can we build transmission as fast as we think we need it for our climate goals? But the other very important question that you haven't answered is, will all that transmission be reliable in the face, again, of extreme weather?
Yeah. I am not aware of significant amounts of transmission outages here in the state as a result of um, climate events. I mean, certainly wildfires are a risk, and our utilities are, spending in order to mitigate those. And we've actually gotten federal dollars in through the Energy Office to help support some of that work from utilities. So I won't say it's not something that we need to plan for, but it's certainly something that we are thinking about and looking at and trying to plan for. In terms
Okay.
of the pace of the transmission investment, I think I'd come back to what I said about Senate Bill 212. We are thinking through that question in light of the legislation last year to look at siting and permitting, including transmission.
Related to the siting and permitting, that is only one part of the equation. Can you share your thoughts on the other side of the equation related to supply chain concerns for high voltage equipment and the labor to accomplish the transmission build, which is admittedly is faster paced than the utilities, not just in Colorado, but across the West? What that is, or across the West, that is required to meet these targets. I'm sorry, I might have botched that reading your question there, Guy. Uh,
I think I've got the gist of it, which is, do we have the workers that we need to do this, and do we have the ability to get the things we need to build the transmission? And I think we we have done some work over the years to try and make sure that we are building a supply chain for workers. I think that there's plenty of national level literature that suggests that we as a country are going to need a lot of electrician and a lot of linesmen to do this work. And, that we're facing sort of a retirement issue on some of that as well. Um, so we're aware of that. We are doing a lot on the workforce front here in the state to try and make sure that we will have the workforce we need, including on the transmission side. On the supply chain issue, I, it's a really great question. I'm not sure that I know the answer, and I'm not sure that the answer that I think I knew 72 hours ago is relevant in light of sort of the last 72 hours. If I could prognosticate on that, I could probably arbitrage something and make a fair bit of money, but it's a problem. And, I think that we are working with the utilities to understand exactly how big that challenge is and what the implications might be for meeting the clean energy and climate goals that we have in Colorado.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and go to somebody asked for a wrap up. So let's go to that one. Do you have any like a summary or takeaways of, the important items for local and state policymakers in terms of the decisions that are ahead of us, given the current environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for us, the big takeaway was that economic deployment scenario, a scenario that relies on a lot of the existing technologies that we have today, including gas as a firm capacity resource, really gets us far down the path of emissions reductions at at a cost, but at no incremental cost to what it otherwise would take to meet load. And that, all of the other scenarios come at some additional cost. And so for us, I think that's the big takeaway, that we've been successful and we think we can continue to be successful on a path that focuses on driving towards the deepest emissions reductions we can, maintaining reliability, and then, having some level of cost guardrail in there.
Okay, sounds great. Well, with that, because we're at the end of our time here, Keith, I want to thank you again for presenting, and I'm sure we'll have you back down the road as the CEO continues to do great work on our behalf. Everyone else, I want to appreciate you for joining tonight. The recording, we will get this out on YouTube. If you want the recording, the raw recording, shoot me an email at the info@crest-energy.org, and I will get it once it's rendered by good old Zoom. So thanks everyone again, and thank you, Keith, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to Crest for the opportunity.
You're welcome.
Good night.
You too.